So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Farrer. I am the Assistant Director of Education and Public Programming here at the Erie Canal Museum. Derek is on vacation today, so he cannot be here, so you'll have to deal with my introduction. Thank you very much for joining us today, both here in person and on Zoom. And also thank you to the Winifred and DeVillo Sloan Family Fund for supporting this event. The impact of the Erie Canal has been immense, socially, economically, politically, and environmentally. And today we're going to explore the environmental history of upstate New York before, during, and after the digging of the Erie Canal. But before we get to that, I just want to let you know about a few upcoming events here at the Erie Canal Museum. Firstly, this Saturday, August 24th, one of our 2024 artists in residence, Clara Riedlinger, will be speaking at the Oneida Community Mansion House about her work this year, which focuses on the spiritual history of upstate and western New York, the landscape known as the Burned Over District. And secondly, on Thursday, September 5th, our Director of Education, Derek Pratt, will be presenting our September Deeper Dive lecture with his talk titled The Center of It All, Baseball on the Erie Canal. Both lunchtime lectures and deeper dives occur monthly and are offered both virtually and in person. So consider signing up for an annual pass for both of those so you never miss a talk here at ECM. Finally, our Beers, Bikes, and Barges rides are underway, and we have a ride tonight here in Syracuse, and then next Thursday evening we'll have another one in Troy. We also have one more walking tour left in our summer walking tour schedule this Saturday. The final one of those will be in Baldwinsville, and it's an infrastructure tour of the lock and the village. And you can see all of the upcoming events on the events page of our website, eriecanalmuseum.org. But now on to today's event. I am happy to introduce David Brooks. David Brooks is the Education Director at Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site in Fort Hunter, New York. He sits on the Board of Trustees for the Fulton County Historical Society, as well as the Montgomery County Historical Society. And he is the former president of the Mohawk Valley Museum Consortium. So without further ado, I'll let you take it over.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here at the Erie Canal Museum. I very often send people this way when they stop in the Schoharie Crossing. And it's cool to hear about the Beers, Bikes, and Barges. You're having one in Troy. So if there's anybody kind of traveling through from the central or western part of the state to try to hit that up in Troy, you could stop in and see me at Schoharie Crossing as well. We have a few things going on at the site, so I'm going to mention that real quick. If you're not in the area and stopping in for the wonderful event here at ECM on the 24th, we have this Saturday Rock the Lock. It's a music event featuring the Greg Bucking Band and Becca Frame and the Tall Boys performing near our visitor center. On Sunday, we have Not Just for Kids storytelling, and that is Kate Dudding and Andy Davis. But we have a bunch of other great events and programs happening at Schoharie Crossing throughout the rest of the season. And next year is going to be off the hook for the Bicentennial 2025. And you can find us on Facebook, our New York State Parks website. If you Google Schoharie Crossing, you will find all of our social media and our parks websites. Follow, like all of that stuff. You can find our YouTube channel and check out some other lectures that we either hosted or presented. And you can immerse yourself in some wonderful Mohawk Valley and Erie Canal history as well. But I am here today to discuss Through the Mire, a look at the environmental history of the Erie Canal. And I will be upfront very early on that this is about the concepts and ideas, not specific data points. When we look back in the last few hundred years, it may not be until much more recently that you could have scientific studies that'll tell you parts per trillion of whatever chemicals in whatever places and stuff. So this is more about the look at the environmental history and concepts and ideas, particularly of the early era and the building of the canal. But for those of you that may or may not be familiar, where the heck is Schoharie Crossing? That's a really good question. So from where I am standing right now, inside the old Waylock building that is the home of the Erie Canal Museum, depending on traffic, it's somewhere about an hour and 40 to 2 hours, depending on the route, to the east before you get to Amsterdam, New York, along the wonderful Erie Canalway and the heritage corridor that exists across New York. So if you're making a tour either on bike or in a car, we're right there. We're conveniently located off the New York State Thruway or Route 5S, and we encompass over 250 acres. We're spread out about 3 miles. We're a very linear site with a boat launch, picnic areas, several features from the enlarged Erie Canal, and we have a half-mile section of Clinton's Ditch, the original Erie Canal, and in that section opened in 1822. And our most famous piece is probably the remnants of the Schoharie Creek Aqueduct. But on the east end of our site, we do also have a double chamber lock from the enlargement, the Putnam Canal store, and it's also on the banks of the Mohawk River, which is in the eastern section. Today's canalized river is the Erie Canal. So you can come and check out all of that. Again, you have events, see programs. The site itself is open from sunrise to sunset every day throughout the year, as long as it's safe for you to be there. So don't come out in an ice storm, it's not safe. And our visitor season for the visitor center and museum we have, it'll end in October. It starts May, runs through October, and that's Wednesday through Saturday, 10 to 5, Sundays, 1 to 5. Or if you're part of a group, you want a special kind of tour off season or on a Monday or Tuesday, get a hold of us. We'd like to accommodate those as well. So there, I feel like I've hit that. So the nuts and bolts of Schoharie Crossing, back in the 1950s, it was noted as the most logical place for an Erie Canal restoration site and museum. And that has a lot to do with the Fort Hunter Canal Society, a grassroots effort that emerged in the 1940s in particular, but up in the early 1950s when they formulated themselves and started actually handing out membership cards with dues that were paid at 50 cents for membership. They began this campaign to really create a site in Fort Hunter, which is in Montgomery County, along the confluence of the Schoharie Creek and the Mohawk River. Because those canal structures still belong to New York State, it made sense for the New York State government to be involved, and the Conservation Department at first did establish underneath Nelson Rockefeller in 1966 as a historic site. It would later evolve and turn into a site within New York State Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over. Anybody familiar with this? Anybody recognize it? It is from Genesis. So it seems fitting to begin at the beginning, to whatever extent that might be. But this is also to put you in the context of the idea of kind of going back mentally a couple hundred years ago to the era in which the new Republic of America exists, and you are in New York State, and this idea that now that we have this new country, what are we going to do with it? And as Ben Franklin would have said, you have a republic, you can keep it. But at this point, this new generation of leaders, particularly in New York State, folks like DeWitt Clinton, are going to look to do something a little bit more. And that idea is to subdue parts of nature, have dominion over, and create an artificial river across New York State. And why in New York State? Because there's a geological advantage. You may have heard of all those efforts down in Virginia where they wanted to canalize along the Potomac, because those Virginians like Madison and Jefferson and even George Washington were looking to make that solution in that location, right in their backyard, right? I mean, no wonder Jefferson thought it was a little short of madness to do that in upstate New York. He wanted it in his own backyard. For those of you that may or may not be watching, I'm not saying there's a Virginia conspiracy here. I'm just saying in context, those from Virginia didn't want it in New York State. But because of the Mohawk Valley across New York State and being that natural break in the chain of mountains that extend most of the eastern seaboard, it makes it a lot easier to build a canal across New York. The Mohawk Valley in particular is not only beautiful, if anybody has driven across New York, if you haven't, or you want to travel or ride your bike, it is just idyllic in so many ways. And it is almost still kind of a rust belt, but it's worth the journey. I'm not going to break all of this down, but because of the geology of New York State and our ancient history, I suppose, and sometimes when I have fourth graders out at the site, I asked, if you want me to really start where the beginning of the Erie Canal story begins, and I'm like, yay! And I'm like, millions of years ago. And you can just kind of see like their face go blank because they're like, oh no, would we just accept, right? But you really need to go back millions of years ago where the development of this area and tens of thousands of years ago, once the giant oceans that had covered what is New York State had receded and we get into a form of ice age and the glaciation that'll happen, it really helps develop those mountain ranges. And eventually, as the ancient ocean recedes, that is what will form the Mohawk Valley. And that is, again, that advantage that New York State has in order to build the Erie Canal. So the creation of limestone and sedimentary layers from that ancient ocean is super helpful when you need limestone blocks to build canal features. And about 10 to 14,000 years ago, when that glacier dam releases and creates a flow of water toward the east to cut the channel, it's just a remarkable thing that happened in New York State's ancient history that means that we can enjoy the history of the canal today. And, you know, it's actually pretty nice to, when you're driven across other states, they don't have a nice, relatively flat throughway. It's kind of nice to just be able to shoot right across the state on a highway that doesn't take you up in a bunch of twists and turns and up through the mountains where you feel like your car is going to die underneath you. I should probably get a better car. But the Erie Canal, as many of you may already know, construction began in July of 1817. They picked the 4th for some bizarre reason. I think we can all probably figure that one out if I really let you sit on it. Completed in 1825. It takes about 8 years. It's $7 million to make a canal that's 363 miles, 83 locks, over 500 feet in elevation difference between Lake Erie in Buffalo and the Albany area at the Hudson River. And Clinton's Ditch, obviously, it's 40 feet wide, 4 feet deep. 7 million would be over 220 million today. And that's only if you're just counting for the inflation. We should probably all be aware, and for those of you here in Syracuse, there's this roadwork thing happening. Like just the other context is the bridge across the Schoharie nearest to the site about 10 years ago when they painted it, cost $7 million just to paint it. Because there's all of this environmental impact studies, there's all this other stuff that's going. So there's infrastructure costs that are drastically different today. So let's kind of keep that in mind when anybody throws out numbers and money. I don't know, the money, it's what's the value of money, really? I mean, it's all, it changes over time. And like, I'd be fine making $1 an hour if it meant I could buy a loaf of bread for a nickel. And for those of you here that can see the pointer, I am going to be pointing from Lake Erie at Buffalo across, just to make sure that you're aware of that transition across New York State, you know, lateral bodies of water and the elevation changes as well. It's just one of those nice old maps to give you the visual if you don't already have it. Pre-canal transportation improvements. Let's rewind before the canal when we're talking about people trying to get across New York State and what environment that they are walking through or boating through, those methods of travel. You have waterway navigation, which seems fairly easy, particularly if you're headed east through the Mohawk Valley, because you have the Mohawk River that flows in that direction. But the problem exists because there's rifts, rapids, sometimes there's low water or not, you know, or maybe there's too much water after a spring freshet or a rain event. So you can use those rivers, the creeks and streams, but a lot of places you're going to have to portage. And that's what happens, particularly in the colonial era. And some folks in the Mohawk Valley, like the Herkimers, will make good money off of the portages around that area. They will make use of their enslaved people as well to help with that. The roads and stagecoach lines were very limited in New York State because, well, I'll get to that. They're rutted, muddy kind of messes. So, I mean, until you start developing roadways that are much more packed and maintained, these are essentially old Haudenosaunee or Native American trails that are turned into European-style roads. And they will connect certain communities, but not everywhere. And it is very difficult and time-consuming and costly to transport goods in the back of a wagon or on a horseback or carrying them yourselves. So the cost of that is very large. Or you could walk. So the idea is that particularly if you're out near Lake Erie and you want to come all the way to the Hudson River to catch up with some of that shipping that can happen out of the old Fort Orange area in Albany and head down to the Hudson out to New York and a global market, it's taking you a very long time. weeks to transport goods and lots of money. And you're doing so through what is quote unquote virgin territory in the West, even though it wasn't quite, and it had been settled and developed in its own way for centuries. But I like to use this illustration because this is what I consider as that you call for an Uber ride, you still have to get out and push. You get a stagecoach line, and in the better form of traffic is in the wintertime because conceivably it's warm, or it's not warm, it's cold, so the ground is frozen enough to get across. But all of those ruts and all of that traffic is churning that up along the way. There is that development of roadways in America, not too many of them, but there is the development. Maybe some of you learned back in elementary school about the corduroy roads. I feel at least here in the room, there's at least part of the audience that learned those kind of things in school. But that's also those plank roads. A lot of those are turnpikes or toll roads, and you have to fell a significant amount of timber in order to build them. You need to grade them off, there's sand in between them, and they're still pretty bumpy as you're jumping across and you're bouncing all the way across it. It's not the most effective form of transportation, but it's at least an improvement. And you can see this is going back to early Republic of America in the 1790s to early 1800s, showing just kind of a limited amount of true large-scale road development to connect the states, no longer the colonies, but the states of America. So the transportation is not super great. The infrastructure is in serious need of development. So those navigational improvements, the Western Inland Lock Navigation Company, forming in the 1790s. We get a lot more folks probably a little bit east that are familiar with Philip Schuyler. Maybe they go to Schuyler Mansion, which is a state historic site, and that's probably mostly because they have this desire to be in the footsteps of Alexander Hamilton. But Philip Schuyler was famous enough in his own right as a general and a landowner in New York during this era, and he was part of this navigation company and operated for just a few short years, but they did waste a lot of money. But they did also do a few small improvements, and that was modifying natural bodies of water, particularly Wood Creek. They created a shortcut of a canal and changed the flow of some of that water, and it helped prove the concept that taking out the oxbow in Wood Creek drastically improved transportation. This is to give you the kind of concept of perhaps that river traffic. So you have these boats, you have bateaus, and then Durham boats that are going to be transporting a few ton at a time. It's labor intensive. A lot of the Durham boats in particular require large timbers for the giant beams that will be across them. And you can't really use sails all the time, but sometimes you could, you have to pull. But this leads to other changes to the natural body of water that is the Mohawk River in particular. So Schultz will travel in 1807, noting obstacles to the journey and how they were overcome. Two lines or ridges of stones generally constructed on sandy, gravelly, or stony shallows in such a manner as to form an acute angle, where they meet, the extremities of which widen as they extend upriver, whilst at the lower end there's just space left to admit the presence of a boat. The water being collected, continually pent up, causes a rise of the passage, which affords an easy passage over the shoal. So that's the nice description of a wing dam in the river. And that is modifying a natural body of water. Mankind is changing that flow by building up stones to funnel and raise the water. So if we're keeping in this concept of how that is an impact of the environment, think about all of the fish and other critters that live in the water. Think about the waterway as a natural flow and it has its own cycles to it. So if you're changing that, what are you changing downstream? One of the most ancient issues in civilization is the Tigris and Euphrates in parts of the Middle East and how that has been changed. And what does it mean for people downriver when you change upstream? Whether you're adding stuff to or removing stuff from. This is sort of an environmental concept here in the Mohawk Valley in particular, that you change this natural body of water. But it does allow for these Durham boats to make passage. It is much more difficult to go back upstream. That's why you would have sails and poles as well. And those early views on nature in America, we're kind of putting ourselves back. Even Dwight Clinton had stated in some of his papers that the beautiful, wonderful, and sublime in reference to the wilderness. You know, he has a true love and appreciation for it. He is a man of that post kind of Enlightenment era where he has a connection to the sciences as well as to his own political goals. That within it, nature is conducted for her operations on a magnificent scale. Particularly when he traveled across New York in 1811 as part of the Canal Commission, and he sees this territory in a very scientific way. He's doing plant research and studies and animals as he's traveling. But he also views it in a very artistic muse kind of way. This is, you're getting to the Hudson River School of Painters. There's this new artistic, trend, and there's American artists. It's not just European artists at this point. And they're really doing, you'll see like in this painting that, it's a very idyllic, this waterway, there's trees in the sky, and it's beautifully painted, but there's people inserted into it. Within the landscape, they are making it a point that it is populated, it's peopled in that way. And therefore, that there's an impact or a play within people and the environment. This appears to be much more of how those two relationships maybe are a little bit more, not really symbiotic in any sort of way, but are less intrusive upon each other. But early Americans, much like other folks for generations, you have a love-hate view on nature to a certain extent because you can fear it as well as love it. It's seen to be conquered, particularly in this era. As I mentioned before, you want to move into the space and settle it. That's a testament to God's endowment to man. But all it takes is a severe wind or a severe rainstorm, a flood, a harsh winter, a bad summer, your crops fail. Even as a merchant out of New York, you have bad winds, maybe your ships go down. Perhaps the bad crops in New York State, even if they can be transported. That's a problem for merchants even in their way of life. So it's something that they're viewing with a different kind of respect. I think we all kind of seem to take certain things for granted now, that I can be in this space, whether I would need air conditioning or heat. I can hop into my car and feel comfortable. I've got the right kind of clothes that I might need at all points. And even if my garden at home fails, I can still go and get something to eat somewhere probably. So in digging in the canal, when we start getting into what that means, the impact across the landscape, each of these sections that are surveyed out and contracted, whether it be a few miles or a few hundred feet, is going to have its own little micro environment around it, but across New York State in a larger sense as well. So early on, you have locals that are going to be doing that work, and bigger contractors will develop as it kind of takes off section by section and year by year in the building of the canal. The ditch has to be cut through swamps. It has to go through rock. You're going to go over ravines. You have to cut through streams and other lateral bodies of water like the rivers. Forests will need to be cleared. Areas that have water need to be drained, and areas that don't have water need water brought to them, because a canal without water is simply a ditch. So you have to take a sense of the hydrology that goes into a canal. Even today, the dams and the water manipulation that goes into it. Such as this area. Is anybody familiar with this location? Does that look familiar to anybody? Anybody that's tuning in can, yes, Montezuma, thank you. But even if those are tuning in, you can type it in the comments of the chat, even if you already know the answer, because that way it makes it look like you knew too. So this is Montezuma Swamp. So in the central part of New York, is folks not too far from here probably might be aware too, that the salt flats of Montezuma Swamps is an impediment. When you try to put a ditch through, you've got too much water. The canal has this problem, too much, not enough, you have this balance. So this cut through the mire and muck, so if you were wondering where I got the through the mire part, it's a total tribute to that. And it also kind of sounds like Mire, so we're kind of looking at it, we're reflecting. See, if you didn't catch that one already, I'll explain it, and then it almost takes away the fun that I had fun with coming up with the title. So again, you have people that are digging through here, they're also encountering the mosquito population. They have to deal with that. There's all the auxiliary forces around them, little baskets where they're trying to keep the smoke going. And it does help when they can do it in cooler weather and the mud's not just like, I'd be super disappointed, even if I was getting paid, to be a laborer where you go and you spend all day digging this ditch. And the next day it's all kind of washed back in because there's too much water. So obviously in this area, they need to cut channels and they are taking water out of where they don't want it. So you are changing a natural space, this giant area, which is now, as we probably may be aware, a large refuge, particularly for migratory birds and other species. So changing this space, they might not have had any real concept of what that would extrapolate later, that you change the area in which these species will exist or they would travel through and the welfare of those species. The deep cut at Lockport, this is one of those things where if you're out in your log, hopefully those folks that are tuning in, if you haven't been to Lockport, you need to go out there. The Discovery Center is great. The flight is great. Get some ice cream while you're out there. And think of me when you have the ice cream because I don't get out there often enough. But this large channel, 7 miles long, being cut directly into the stone. I know that if you go on to YouTube or you see the History Channel's thing about, oh, it's always about the Irishman and they set it on fire and they just put a shovel over their head and boom. But they're using black powder to create this cut through stone, which might not seem like a huge environmental impact, but you are obviously manipulating the landscape, which will change that. And this is obviously in the middle of stone, isn't where water as a channel or an artificial river would normally exist. You have to bring the water in and you are putting it somewhere else when you're done with it after having gone through the stone.
We are cutting the
I put this here, this is my break for a drink, I apologize.
Through the mire, right up to our necks. Damn it, we're cutting the ditch through the mire. And the mud is our principal fire in our pet.
All right, so I took this whole class back in college where they're like, don't tell your audience your tricks. And it's like, well, that's specifically so I can stop for a drink, but I can also mention, even though it has hardly anything to do with the environmental part, that obviously the canal has a huge component that is social and cultural, where even the labor force and the immigrants that are coming in, maybe they're using like an old English tune and changing the words to it to convey their own meaning and message. And the Song of the Diggers, since we're talking about digging of the canal, I kind of feel like I have to pay homage to the labor. And because of the labor, that's another kind of impact that we can kind of think about today. When we think about these areas of New York State that don't have population that is huge at this point, let's say, there might have been people living in those areas before, but you have a labor force that comes into it, they cut a channel, they're using giraffe animals, you have the auxiliary supports, you have all the supporting labor, you have, cooks and cleaners, all of that stuff, these little shanties that have been built. So you're felling trees for the creation of locks and gates and cofferdams. You're diverting water, but you also need lumber for the little sheds or for cooking with or doing laundry with. And all of those kind of things kind of go into the draft animals too. If we only wanted to do a study on the existence of the towpath Erie Canal and the amount of manure that is created along its towpath, that is also something. And all of those people and all those animals are obviously consuming as well as putting things out. So all of that has to be brought in or taken into that location. The technological advances is another one of those things, but hopefully you're all kind of with me where we're looking at this as a concept as it moves forward. Because the canal is having these advances in technology, the plow and scraper, that helps it easier to cut through the dirt and the roots, making it more efficient. It's going to help in agricultural impact. It helps increase the ability to grow crops, not just build a canal. The agricultural societies in New York State, the state fair is happening right now in Syracuse. And that's the old gentleman's club of the agricultural society that's developed into the state fair. Those technological advances that are also emerging along the canal as part of this become adopted by people within the agricultural field. So these larger spaces can be farmed more and more. It helps produce. It helps population growth. That also has an environmental impact onto the soils. And that's where you eventually lead into things where they are putting fertilizers back into it. If you want kind of a thought process, you can jump forward into the Dust Bowl era of America across the West. the over farming and the methods of farming at that era led to the Dust Bowl. We didn't necessarily have that happen because of the canal, but I'm just trying to put that out there that is an impact. The tree feller and stump puller also help remove timberland much quicker. If you can pull out the stumps, when it would take you years to girdle and cut trees or just to fell them and then burn out their stumps, but now you can do it perhaps much quicker because of these advancements and this ability to do so. It means that your fields can be more productive quicker. And again, you have more food. Normally that means more people. And you're pulling stuff from the soils. Obviously, the hydraulic cement, those kind of things that they're pulling locally. And eventually, there's other minerals that are going to be pulling out, which I believe I talked about as well. As fast as a half dozen trees were cut down, a factory was raised up. It looks as if the demon of machinery, having invaded the peaceful realms of nature, has fixed as a battleground on which they should strive for mastery. So this is Francis Trollope, just a couple short years after the canal fully opens, commenting about how, well, we probably are all aware that the canal is the mother of cities. You know, along the canal, these towns turn into cities and little villages turn into towns and little nothing spots turn into villages. And eventually they grow more and more people. And so in this illustration from Lockport, you can kind of see where the development around the canal exists. And a lot of that is the factories that are going there. The waterway is not only a way to transport goods, but you could use wastewater or inflow water from feeders. The state was a little bit more like kind of relaxed about some of that stuff, and you could power your machinery that way. But Francis here had nothing nice to say about New York, nothing nice to say about Americans being an English woman traveling across the canal. She had absolutely nothing nice to say. Went up in Canada, made good money not harassing, I should say, writing and haranguing about the people of America. But she makes probably a valid point here, so far as the demon of machinery. If you look toward the idea I mentioned earlier, we're getting into the concept of Genesis and the views a few hundred years ago about God's endowment and the natural landscape of New York. Pristine landscapes are going to be transformed. These factory towns that I put in this little small clip of a quote here from a tourist of Buffalo saying it set my bowels in uproar when talking about drinking water. Hopefully all of us are doing well in drinking clean water, but you can imagine being on a canal boat and not being overly happy about drinking some bad water. Very little privacy. If you come to the Canal Museum in this old Waylock building and you're downstairs on that level and you're in the old Waylock itself and you go on the barge down there with the exhibit, you can see what it might have looked like so far as this tourist would have had to experience where the necessary space would be. Notables, Hawthorne and others talk about the devastation of the forests and the draining and rerouting of the waterways. What makes that interesting though is because they're traveling across, they're seeing this change in the landscape. Basil Hall talks about the murdered forests of New York. He comes from England. So you have this idea of these parts of England, parts of Europe. Well, part of the reason why the British took the colony of New York from the Dutch is because they wanted the natural resources, particularly some of the large standing timber of the Hudson Valley for their massive navy. So he comes from a place that does not have those kind of forests. And so him noting the murdered forests is a recognition of what this location had that is now being taken away. This is a wonderful painting. I'm forgetting the artist for it in particular, but this painting is in the collection of the Arkell Museum at Schoharie. Schoharie is a nice little canal town. The Arkell Museum, I don't get paid by them, but there's a nice plug. If you were in the area, it is a must-see. Check out their exhibits. And you can also find this painting and others from their collection, their Erie Canal art. If you go onto our YouTube channel, a story across YouTube, Mary Alexander and I have a presentation we've done called Perennial and Framed, where we talk about some of the canal art. She talks about the art and the artist, and I talk about the history. It's worth checking out. Particularly this painting, we go into more depths about some of the things that I won't necessarily point out here, so you want to check it out, because there's not quite environmental devastation, but there's a little unsanitary action happening in this painting that you might not otherwise realize. So check that.
The name of the painting?
I don't recall, and I should have it in my notes, and I don't, so I apologize. But it's definitely worth checking out. So population production, I mentioned before, more production, more people. success of the canal means transportation goes down, costs go down, production goes up. And all of that timber, grain, agricultural products, the minerals, being in Salt City, it makes sense to talk about the salt that's being produced in the Syracuse area. Whether that's solar evaporators, right to the point where they are producing or not producing enough solar, so they need to burn timber. They're creating charcoal and burning it off to evaporate the water out of the saltwater marshes. Salt is a human necessity for preservation of food, but also for our bodies. And still, from my understanding, very vitally important, to everybody, even if you only just want to walk from your front door to your car in the middle of winter, you might want a little bit of salt. So those manufactured goods are going out to people, but you also have other things that are coming in, finished goods, clothing, food. We could go even further on the concept of some of these things, the plant life and the seeds that are coming in some of the foods. Maybe there's some things attached to the boats. You have this big push today about invasive species coming along on boats, whether it's ballast or zebra mussels, not just the bait fish, the round goby that's happening, but all of these things are starting to kind of flow across. Diseases amongst people, yellow fever in particular is starting to pass, so that's having an impact as well. This Yankee migration is fostered by the success of the Erie Canal, this great movement of New Englanders across New York State into the what we now consider the Midwest, is also kind of creating this movement of that, this flow of people and this goods. It's having that impact, and within the first decade, Albany's population increases 96%. Utica is 183, Syracuse 282, Buffalo 314, Rochester 512%. More production, more people, you need more space, more housing, more everything, really, which also means they're producing more waste. And this is also an era where sanitation is not what we think of today. Everybody's outhouse or open sewer lines into natural bodies of water, rivers, streams, creeks, or even just the canal. And between those towns, the locks and the ports, there's still parts of this nice idyllic pieces of upstate New York that people are passing through. So it's really like this really interesting juxtaposition between these pleasant places where you're kind of going through these little farmlands, and boom, it is the demon of machinery, as Trollope had said. This giant village and the black smoke spewing out of factories as well. So I think that is a thing to note, and you can still kind of see those things today when driving across not only New York, but parts of the country. So those very landscapes brought, it's proving to people that civilization is into nature now, which is something that they were striving for. Again, to have dominion over. You're going to bring civilization into this wild area. And people could see that as they were particularly passengers or along the way, or they were using it to get out and settle new areas. So as much as nature was like a temple and a place to commune with God, this human endeavor of technology winds up encroaching in on that concept of what God has given human beings of this iconic, we kind of view like those images, this beautiful nature, right? This is also the era where, because the cities are getting bigger, particularly the success of the canal leads to the bigger, more populated New York City, and you have a lot of folks that want to leave the city. You see that perhaps in this area today, or where I live in the lower Adirondacks, you get a lot of city folk that come out to experience nature. And this is what they're trying to do. Civilization is brought into nature, and then where it's really civilized, people want to go into nature, but then they bring civilization with them, and it's like this constant battle to run away from their own tail. And humanity, it was thought perhaps had tamed the wilderness, but maybe it hadn't, because there are things along the canal that do cause other issues with the environment, but also issues for the operation of the canal. And that's why you have pathmasters and hurry-up teams. So when you have these horses and mules that are going through and they're putting all of their excrement out, but there's also a washout of some other canal break that puts that water that, again, is not any natural space, that's been pulled from some other natural source, and then it floods it out somewhere else where it's really not supposed to be. And a lot of times that can be in a farmer's field. Syracuse, in the latter part of the major canal era, did experience its own big washout. right in the middle of downtown. There's some incredible photographs of that I think is astonishing that nobody was really like hurt or killed. So once that was a culvert of some kind that washed out and everybody spun around, it's kind of cool to see everything all twisted that way. So those could mean disaster, delays, lost profit, but again, they also do mean that you have dirty water flowing in places it's not normally supposed to be or not supposed to have water in at all. So the canal, as you probably are all aware, was a huge success. The improvements that go through it brings economic success. You have the population growth. Now the what had been the West becomes the Midwest, and it helps lead to a transcontinental America. The railroad industry kind of, it's only because the canal is a success, but railroads can be a success, right? So they are spewing forth their steam and dirt and tracks everywhere across America by the 1860s. So you have this enlargement that'll happen on the canals. They make it bigger and better, so you need more resources for that. So that's more timber and more rock and more labor and more people. And more factories are going to kind of get built up around them. And it's going to be a larger industrializing north because the canal leads to this ability for transportation. And then you have the improvement era of the 1880s and 1890s where they make things a little bit bigger and better again. They widen it, deepen it. And the double chambered locks, they'll elongate it so you can have these double headers go through. And of course, I always like to mention the 1896 $9 million plan that really did hardly anything except spend a bunch of money. You may or may not believe the state government has always been like state government. Ralph Waldo Emerson would have said that a canal is a system, therefore a machine, which kills the human spirit and numbs it to nature. It did enliven the state, however, it did provide New York State with the ability to become the Empire State, thriving economic hub across what is discovered by our industrial Rust Belt of New York today was this thriving, all those demons of machinery churning away, the economic vitality that was, it was said something to the effect when they opened it up that if the canal be a success, it would the benefits would flow into the lap of New York City. And I'm paraphrasing, kind of butchering that a little bit. But New York City becomes the economic hub of the world. And New York City grows, and there's all this other things. You go down New York City, and sometimes you watch the two rats fight each other for a piece of pizza. They have turtles at home they have to feed. Don't worry about it. Just let them have the pizza. And if you didn't get that joke, you should Google. Anyway. All right. So again, water is the major point. I talk about the population, the people, the industries. You have that, but ultimately it really comes down to water, putting water where it's not supposed to be, and taking it from places it does. So you do that. You might have to build an aqueduct, so you're going over it, but you need to supply water over it. So those feeder canals, like here near Rexford, you're pulling water from the river and diverting it into an artificial waterway. If you happen to have too much, you have to put it into a waste weir, which is also a breeding ground for things like mosquitoes. And you have taken over this low-lying area or developed another area that was swampy or water anyway, put more water into it. So you've disrupted the equilibrium of that space. So you have a lot of barges that are going to put water lower through the system. But every time you're launching, particularly in cities that kind of have an open sewer, you're churning the stuff up and moving those things along in the water. Whether it be, dead cats or horses or excrement. That's all kind of moving along the way. A lot of the runoff from industrializing locations is kind of going into it. And you can kind of see even in the early 20th century, in Oneida Lake, Onondaga too, you've got the Genesee River in Rochester being heavily polluted. The Mohawk is polluted to some degree, and the Hudson very much polluted because of businesses or industries along the canalway. But there is I kind of feel like I at least have to put a little bit of a silver lining on some of this. There's been a transformation. So because of all this Yankee migration, and I like to point out that Vermont lost like 50% of its population. Sorry, the person from Vermont. Within like the first decade of the canal opening, this whole migration across. It means that those farms are kind of abandoned. They can be reforested. I love going for hikes in either parts of New England or in New York State. And you're going through the woods and there's a stone wall there. And it's because it used to be ag land and it's reforested now. And it's kind of an interesting, there's still a scar or a landmark from human interaction. Those kind of rows of stone don't happen naturally. So it's either the extraterrestrials or it's humans. Agriculture will change not only like parts of New York, because all of this major ag moves out to the Midwest and the West, but particularly in New England, agriculture will change to dairy and things like wool or sheep. And again, the reforestation. And that kind of leads to, by the 1870s and 1880s, because of things happening along the canal, the dropping water levels coming in, there becomes this campaign to preserve what was being called at the time as the Northern Wilderness. It didn't get the moniker of Adirondacks yet. So New York State will establish the Adirondack Park in the 1880s because that wilderness ensures the regulated water and supply for New York's rivers and canals. The rich folk down in New York realized that the water levels were being impacted because the Adirondacks were being impacted. This is in the era in which these state lands of the northern wilderness were being used up by companies that come in, often off a tax sale, or they default, somebody else would default and come in. They take the timber, they get the iron ore and other mineral deposits out, and then they bounce before their taxes were due. The state lands were also where a lot of that taxation would help fund state education. But these folks were disappearing, not paying their share, and also that impacts the watershed. You don't have the trees holding the soil will wash away. The rainfall will wash away quicker, it's being held into the soil or into that space to eventually slowly fill up those lateral bodies of water that will come in to help feed into the canal or parts of the Mohawk, and particularly in the eastern section. So that's a major impact. The other impact, or the other part behind that, is all the rich folks in New York, again, wanting to leave civilization to go to the wilderness that was being cut down and destroyed. So it's all the more reason to preserve the Adirondacks. So you have images of the Adirondacks and the logging and the roadway. And then that leads us up into the late 1890s, early 20th century, where this idea is we need to make sure our canal is still competitive. We have the technology to create this barge canal system. These technological advances, particularly are the steam shovel. And in doing so, we're going to canalize natural bodies of water. No longer do we only have to have an artificial river. Now we have the technology to manipulate natural bodies of water as we see fit. This is another kind of thing of humanity having dominion over this natural space. And what they're also going to do is they'll eliminate certain sections of the historic alignment of the canal. Oddly enough, this little area here that includes this part of Syracuse. And they're going to put the canal up through Oneida Lake, a natural body of water. This is the end of that towpath era, so things are going to be motorized using different fuel sources, which also put different kind of pollution into the air and into the soil. They canalized the Mohawk River as well and completely changed that. So these iconic images of the Erie will transform from this beautiful image from 1852 with the Miller painting of Little Falls, goes from that to the industrialization. You know, this is the timber industry. This is lumber in Albany. The lumber yard in Albany actually was within the top 7 or so lumber yards in the entire world for many, many decades, because it's along the Erie and Champlain canals. So the timber industry could, all the timber of the Adirondacks and across the canalway could be funneled into this space to go out either down to the city or other places, or even to a global market to be sold. Then it turns into this, is they canalize different areas in different ways. So I can look out the window here at the Canal Museum, and I can look at Erie Boulevard where the Erie Canal was. And I can be in North Albany on Erie Boulevard, or any sort of Canal Street or Erie Street, almost anywhere that the canal is no longer. If you dig down, you're most likely to find fill. And a lot of that fill is going to be garbage and trash. Because at this point in time, in the early 1900s, when they were transitioning to today's barge canal, and the section they were taking the canal out, people were actually kind of excited. Because you didn't have the filthy canal going through your backyard anymore. Some of the businesses bemoaned it, obviously. But there was a lot of people that were quite glad to see that filthy canal no longer passing through their town or under their windows. So it was filled in. And because of, particularly in the area out near Schoharie Crossing, the canal goes into the Mohawk River. That barge canal system that completely manipulates the river into a now artificial system with their large movable dams means that you're kind of disconnected from even the natural body of water. For generations almost, because the canal in the Mohawk Valley in particular has gone into the river, it's not through communities anymore in the same way. But there's also the development of the New York State Thruway in the 50s. You have routes 5 and 5S, and you had train lines on both sides of the river, which meant you physically at that point had a disconnection to that body of water. So even if you're in that civilized space and you have nature running and rolling and flowing past you, you're completely disconnected to it. And today's canal is kind of viewed as mostly a recreation way. And there are attempts to be made by communities, as well as state agencies like Canal Corporation underneath NYPA and New York State Parks, to try to connect people back to bodies of water and reconnect them to the outdoors and to nature. So we can still remain that civilized people with connections to nature and hopefully balance it out in some way through different forms of stewardship and preservation and just conserving our natural environment the best we can. And there's a lot of changes to that. Part of it comes out in the 1960s during the state constitutional convention, because the state likes to change their constitution every so often. And that says, passes entirely 175-0, protection and conservation of natural resources and the scenic beauty of the state are important public objectives. The natural beauty of New York State is important to the people of New York State. And there's a particular unique, interesting natural beauty along the Erie Canal. I will paraphrase the late Thomas Grasso from the Canal Society of New York and professor that it's the one time in which mankind had made something that laid so beautifully within the landscape. And that's kind of true. And I think that starting in that era and up to today, we can hopefully see that as we travel along the canal, that humans are making that attempt now much more than ever to realize that there's a balance that we can strike. The establishment also in the wilderness character significance, but in the 90s, the Recreation Way Commission, and then later on the inception of things like Parks and Trails New York, state parks involvement, a lot of the promotion toward this historic waterway is to get people out to experience them within, as I mentioned before, nature, and facilitating that, showcasing that natural beauty as well. And this is one of the movable dams. This is actually dam number 8 in the Mohawk River at Lock E12 in Tribes Hill, right next to Schoharie Crossing. But this is the shameless part where I show you these beautiful images, and I feel like I'm trying to Ron Popeil sell you to come out to the site. So you can come out anytime in the year and walk the historic towpath during the winter or in the fall along the bike path. You can come check out how part of nature has reclaimed the historic canal along the enlargement that we have, the miles of towpath trail, the bird species are part of the iBird New York Trail the EC has, as well as we allow and hopefully encourage migrations of different species through our area. And we still have these beautiful canal features that you can come and explore that are sort of like their own Thomas Cole painting. Come out and see how nature has slightly reclaimed it, but we're not going to let nature take all of it back because we want to tell you the history of the canal. You come out and paddle and bike at our site, take a nice walk. And this new canal, the State Constitutional Convention, again in the early 1990s, puts the canal in the control underneath the Canal Corporation, which is on the Thruway Authority and is now underneath NYPA. It is renamed once again the Erie Canal to harken back into that heritage and the rise. And this is an old number about the tonnage, but this rise of tonnage is coming up in the last few years. And it is a recreational way for people to come and experience, and they can still see those bucolic kind of imagery of New York as they pass through, or they ride their bike, or they go on their boat, and all of the great amenities that the cities would have for them as well, so they can see that and be in touch with it. And sometimes you'll even happen across some music on an old historic canal store porch. But I would encourage you to come out to the site and enjoy it. And remember too that nearly 70%, give or take, of the last census of New York State's upstate population lives very close to the canal system. And I have this little lovely soapbox moment, my written thing, so I feel like I've covered this right. The Erie Canal was forged across an idealized landscape to overcome nature and cut a waterway throughout the wilderness. The waterway allowed for great success of not only New York State, but the country. And if we look at the Erie Canal and ecology together, and if we take in some of the words of the environmentalist and author Roderick Nash, land and life is a complex organism functioning through interaction of its components. We can kind of fully conceive that we are part of that. We can see that nature is an intricate web of interdependent parts and a myriad of cogs and wheels. Each of those are essential to the healthy operation of the whole. At times, it may seem that some of those wheels might need a little greasing, a cog or two a little cleaning, but each of it does have its role. And humans saw correct what they saw as the squeaky wheels. Early New Yorkers dug deep to clear a path to the future with enterprise, ingenuity, and some environmental devastation across God's canvas along the way. The canalway was enough success to essentially work itself out of its original purpose. It fostered the advancement of other technologies such as the railroad system and proving that transportation not only meant business and security, but stability as well. Environmental historian Michael Hyman will point out that the Erie Canal is opposed to the civilization and nature growing together and the struggle to be apart as we go in that effort to be civilized into the wilderness. Henry David Thoreau noted in 1854, the interconnectedness and use of trade and economy rooted humanity directly to the soil, as substance of life, quote, attached me to the earth. The products from raw goods to finish that traveled in so many forms across the now scarred landscape of New York State have their roots within the earth, and thereby so does each person's life that intersects with us, such as ourselves here today or you that are online. It's a wonderful, this 1950s image of the remains of the aqueduct in Fort Hunter and how that looked even in 2015 as the greenery comes. Well, first off, it's green because it's a color photo. The other part is that there is growth again. You can see the clean, clear waterways or cleaner waterways that we are all striving toward as well. So I appreciate your time. I hope that you enjoyed the journey through the concepts of the environmental history as we look through that, and not necessarily all the data. I'm sorry I don't have the parts per million of or the what was in all the horse and mule pieces that you may or may not have wanted to explore. So I would entertain questions. It doesn't necessarily mean I have an answer, but I would entertain them. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, very good. Question?
Terrific.
Oh, thanks.
Presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
About here 2 years ago, I learned and just took it in. So thank you so much.
Nice. I appreciate that.
Something to visit.
Yeah.
But the question, you mentioned two things that I don't think I heard you before. One was use of oxen. I never talked about oxen being used a lot. Like maybe others know about that. Secondly, the fact that there were some blocks that were established by the navigation company. Never did know that.
All right. So yeah, the oxen weren't really heavily. First of all, mules always get way more play. So there's questions about the oxen and about the locks from the Western M Lock Navigation Company. So if you were not able online to hear that one, any sort of draft animal, or especially early on during the construction of the canal, they were utilizing. There were different species of oxen or cattle that had been yoked in some way. Particularly early on, they're going to be able to use those for draft animals as they start bringing in more of those. Yeah. So the launch of the Western Inland Lock Navigation Company, I'm not sure. I think there is some stuff here at the museum downstairs on the first floor that kind of talk about that a little bit. So that was a private stock company. There was also the Northern Navigation Company that was going to do some improvements up along what winds up being the Champlain Canal corridor. I wouldn't necessarily do it, particularly right now, but there could be a very great presentation about that entire history, about the involvement of folks in the private stock. There was well-to-do families that were kind of involved in that, and again, it lasted for about 5 years, and it spent a lot of money without really returning much of any dividend for the investors. But if nothing else, I like to at least give them credit for proving that concept of that even a short canal of a mile could greatly improve the transportation time and ability across it. So the Western Inland Lock Navigation Company deserves, I think, its own presentation, which if you don't have somebody lined up for that, you should. But yeah, it's, they developed those lines, like rubble, stone and timber, and they would fail repeatedly or they wouldn't last. That happens even after the creation of the Erie, where you have all these lateral canals that everybody wants a canal. It's like the fidget spinner of the 1820s and 30s. And that reference only hits certain people the right way. But everybody wanted one, right? So the issue a lot of times was some of those lateral canals that they're starting to build, it's a private stock company or maybe there's state involvement. It's not up to the same standard of the Erie because they're trying to do it quicker and cheaper. So the Western Lock Navigation Company used those, locks that weren't going to last. But they did help prove the concept that it was worthwhile. So, yep. Any question?
Well, I know during the canal season, by the time you got to the summer, the canal itself is a really dangerous conveyor of pathogens and all sorts of horrible pollutants. I wonder what were the main diseases that spread by it?
Well,
Was it, I know dysentery. What was conveyed and most feared?
most feared, like, yellow fever, influenza, yellow fever, that actually leads into this whole, like, really bad view on immigrants. It was kind of viewed, it was kind of pushed off on particularly the influx in the 1830s of Irish immigration into New York, along the canal. That they were kind of seen as that they were the vector for the disease that was traveling. A lot of that is just poor hygiene. All of the other, like I said, those horses and mules and people, the excrement in different places, bad water, and just the mosquitoes. I mean, particularly around the waterway, and where you have those waste weirs and those overflows and swampy areas, they're just leading to that breeding ground for all of that, the disease to be able to be contracted. And obviously, close proximity to people on a canal boat. If you're a passenger, they pack like 100 people into a packet boat. But just close proximity near the locks and canal stores and in the cities and towns is just, it makes it that much worse. Yeah.
I wondered, I know when they were working in the Montezuma swamp area, they called it, workers would get what they call Genesee fever.
Mhm.
What was Genesee fever?
I think one of the level ones of being like, it's a yellow fever, it's a malaria,
Did they actually have malaria up there?
yeah, so the mosquito population being great, and obviously a mosquito popping around and, getting a little bit of your blood and getting a little bit of your blood and getting a little bit of your blood, is going to do that. And you're in close proximity to other people and the sanitary conditions aren't well. So that I get folks that will come in and they talk about, wouldn't it have been nice and it would have been great to travel 4 miles an hour and it's just great. Yes, but I also, like, if I step on a rusty nail, that's not a death sentence for me. So there's a lot to be said about this modern world and, the overcoming of diseases. There's not too many people you hear about in upstate New York dying of malaria anymore, or having any sort of, or even scarlet fever that would eventually emerge later on along the canal and different communities, being a big issue. So, and then, flus, just, again, it's closing of season where everybody's trying to get off the system before things freeze up too. And you're coming into a community or a town, these port cities, you wind up, even down up, like off the Jersey coast in New York City, where you have these large communities of boats that are all tied together. Pretty easy for you to pass your germs to everybody else. So, disease is one of those things that there's a part of me that's kind of grateful. And now that we've lived through this pandemic that's happened in the last few years, hopefully we all have a greater appreciation for what that would have meant, to deal with. Which kind of leads me to the horse influenza. So that's a whole different topic that Travis Bowman does. It's worthwhile. And I don't know if you can convince him to come out here. But it's worth it. It's definitely worth it. So, and it's almost like you were coughing on cue in the audience. So I appreciate that. You help give, that's the auditory support to the conversation. I didn't know this came with sound effects. So any other questions, comments, concerns? I would take stone recipes. You can email david.brooks@parks.ny.gov.
Ask, I think, either when you talk about the over right here, characters or might have been referring to one of the images.
Oh, yeah.
if that was an indicator of work road in Medina. But anywhere in Pennsylvania?
I don't have that in, the canal break that I showed, was in Pattersonville. And then we talked about the culvert here in Syracuse. But there's several great images, and I know that there's one that just I saw on social media of, the culvert. As the Seneca chief, the replica boat was going over it. I think that's, I'm gonna blank on, he's fairly well known out this way, John. I feel really bad now. He does amazing work out this way. And I apologize profusely. But it was a great image of this replica boat going over the culvert on the canal. That's worth checking out. So I didn't have that image or any image of that in the presentation, so.
And then you mentioned the tree feller and stump puller in the same bullet point. How did the tree feller work?
Oh, so, okay, so about the tree fell and stump puller, there's a lot of, there's probably some decent schematics for the stump puller.
Yeah, maybe
And-
we'll have that fixed.
Yeah. Tree feller is similar enough concept in the sense that you have a wheel mechanism with a rope. And the idea is that you can attach the rope high enough on the tree that you can bend it over and snap it off. You're not using that for the really large ones, so you're not gonna be able to get that, but you can very easily take smaller diameter trees and just pull them right over. And a lot of times if you pull a tree over that way in a very similar method, you're also pulling out the small root structure, which you can use those scrapers or those plows just to cut those up and dig them out. So, there's, some forestry management and there's still things that are used like that, or the stump puller to remove, those kind of trees. Yeah, so it's just that couple of wheels with a rope high enough up, it's stabilized, the horse can pull on one end and it exerts that extra force and that, the mechanical advantage of wheels and mechanisms, just pull it right over, so. Yep. We could build one here sometime, I'll come back out, I mean, as long as I have donuts, I will come in, I will put some labor into it, so, yep.
Any other questions on Zoom? There's not any in the chat right now. Second, well, thank you very much for
Thank you.
coming out.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here and the audience, and, hopefully we'll see you at Schoharie Crossing.